All right.
All right, I'm ready.
We're here for another week of Doc Talks, and this week we get to speak about it's a word that strikes fear into people, and it is one of those ones that people come into the office and say, I'm inflamed, and we want to dive into a little bit more of what that really means. The topic was named 3 sneaky ways that our body's getting inflamed, or there's inflammation being produced in our body. So let's first talk about what inflammation is.
Yeah. So you hurt yourself. You want to heal as quickly as possible. Wolverine status if you're a comic book geek. How does your body do that? We're glad you asked. The inflammatory response is a normal, let me stress that, normal part of your body's healing process. And in fact, it's one of the first stages of healing. So what happens is if you step on something and you puncture your foot, there's a bleeding response. Immediately that happens. And the inflammatory response kicks in, and what that does is it brings a lot of good chemicals and molecules and immune cells to help clean up any of the bad stuff in the area. So like if you got any dirt in the dirt or anything like that, it cleans that up. And it does things to promote healing in the area. So it is a normal thing that should happen. And after an injury, it should last about 3 to 7 days, the inflammatory response. And it's, as Dr. Booth will talk about, it's when things go beyond that when it becomes a problem.
Yeah, I mean, we have patients all the time. You know, I'm inflamed, or I have inflammation in my back or my hand or whatever injury that they have, and sometimes I'll be like, cool, we got inflammation. That means you're alive. You know, it means we have something that's going on. If you hurt yourself, you definitely need inflammation to provide nutrients to the area to start healing that. It's really bad if that doesn't happen. Then we start having a depressed immune system, and that can be pretty bad later on. But looking at a natural occurrence versus an overreaction, there's definitely a big difference between having a little injury and having a massive response, or having a little injury and having a little response in terms of the histamine system or the inflammation system of our body. So when we have stuff that's like a natural occurring inflammatory process, like Zach said, around 3 days, it should start cooling off at that time if everything's going as needed. You know, there's not additional injuries, there's not something else going on in your body that's kind of perpetuating this inflammatory system and keeping it around longer than it should be. So natural occurrence, looking around 3 up to 5 days, I'd say, and then an overreaction, something that stays around for much longer periods, and it's constantly something that is inflamed. So you can see that by redness, puffiness, swelling in an area. If that stuff sticks around, that could be a sign that you are overinflamed, or you're having inflammation be perpetuated for longer than normal.
Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned that, because we both get clients who do say, my back is inflamed, or I just feel inflamed. If you really don't have those symptoms, where you have swelling, it's red, like these are the cardinal signs, as we call it, of inflammation. If you look up on Google, you know that one picture where it's like the different statues? I kind of want one at some point, or maybe the statues themselves. That would be cool.
Yeah, pictures up here.
Yeah. It may not be the case that you are inflamed. Now, that being said, so that would be inflammation due to an injury, which is mostly what we would deal with. Now, you can also have other systemic factors that contribute to inflammation. This is where autoimmune diseases come into play, or something like a condition like rheumatoid arthritis, which is a systemic or total body, or a body system's inflammatory response. Or if you're someone who has recurring gut issues, maybe you have irritable bowel syndrome, or you have SIBO, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and you bloat a lot with meals. That is an inflammatory response as well. So you can also have those things at play that may be a contributing factor to things. But the name of the game with inflammation is it is normal. It's a response that your body's using to help you heal from whatever it is that you're doing. And we want to make sure we do things, as we'll talk about, that keep it in check and use it as needed.
Yeah, and just going over everything that goes into inflammation, because there's a lot of people that don't really understand the true definition of inflammation. They'll say, yeah, you know, I sprained my ankle and my ankle swole up, and it, you know, that's typically what they think of as inflammation. Like you said, systemic inflammation is, it has the same processes in our body, but it's activated by different actions that we actually take. So we're going over 3 actionable things that can create sneaky inflammation. So first, we want to talk about what is like the ammo of maybe creating an environment for a high inflammatory response, which would be what we're putting into our body, the foods that we put into our body. We had a couple of weeks ago, my wife was on here and she was talking about some of the interventions with her patient base, and a lot of it has to do with how can we control inflammatory processes that go into the body. We talked about sleep, we talked about a bunch of different things, but food is like, it's very high on there, like extremely high, because the sneaky ways that we, you know, our body responds to different foods can play a big picture of how our body actually responds to an injury or an insult to tissues. So if we have white bread and we're eating a lot of dairy, and that's something that's highly inflaming your system, then you're gonna have a lot of extra inflammatory processes whenever pain or damage does occur in your body. So looking at very common foods that might be inflammatory to the body. There's tons of blogs on the internet that can get you an idea of everything to consider. And it's not going to be specific to you. You have to figure that out with someone, a professional that's gonna guide you on which foods are going to be inflammatory to you. Because Zach has an inflammatory food for him. It does not mean that I'm also going to have that inflammatory food. Everyone's like demonizing gluten right now. There's plenty of people that respond very well to gluten and they can eat it no problem. So don't lump yourself into other people's sensitivities, or don't believe that, you know, one food is demonized, because food is very dynamic between different people.
Yeah, just like anything. You know, you wouldn't do the same exercise program that Arnold Schwarzenegger did because he had big muscles, because you might be built different than him. Or same thing with like LeBron James's basketball workouts. Well, don't do that anyways if you look at what he does.
Get that high.
But these programs are not going to make you the prototypical person of whoever you're trying to emulate, because you are different than that person. And that is so true when it comes to food.
Yeah.
Because you might respond negatively to certain foods because the bacteria in your stomach, which is normal, is going to be different than, say, it is from the person next to you.
Absolutely.
So that's definitely something important to consider. There is one thing that is actually really useful to help you mitigate the inflammatory response of food, and that is the acid-base balance of certain foods. So an acid is something that lowers the, well, I'll give you an example. Say you're doing a really hard sprint, and think about what you feel in your legs. Oh, you get this sick burn in your legs, you know, your quads are just toasted. You can't breathe well, all of this stuff. Well, what's going on in that case in your body is you're having a buildup of certain molecules that promote acid buildup in the tissues. And then when you're recovering from that, you have things that move that acid out that reduce the acid load on the tissues. And this would be, the term would be basic or alkaline. Food does very similar things. There's a thing, and I'll link this in the show notes if you're bored to tears, called, have you heard of the potential renal acidic load, the Prahl score of food?
I have not.
Yeah.
I'm sure my wife does.
She probably has. But there's actually a lot of research showing that there's certain foods that have a particular load on the kidneys that can have systemic effects that are more acidic, and there's other foods that are more alkaline or basic. Now, that doesn't mean that when we're talking about inflammation, I must avoid all acidic foods. But the key is you want to have a balance between those two things. And so I'll give you some examples of what would be acidic versus alkaline. Acidic foods would be meat products, dairy, nuts are kind of in the middle, some grains. Those would be acidic foods. Alkaline foods are mostly your fruits and vegetables and some nuts. And what I learned when because I took a course where they kind of talked about there's actually a lot of validity to this, is basically you need to have a balance of both of those things, because acid can be good in some cases, for example, muscle building. You want that acid response so you can get huge like Kyle over here. But you also need the alkaline response to help mitigate the inflammatory response. So that's something you can definitely consider. I'll link the Prahl score in there. It's actually really fascinating to check out.
Yeah, that'd definitely be helpful for kind of analyzing maybe your weekly intakes and seeing how much of those you have, and what kind of state your body is in based off of just maybe an acid or an alkaline state. So good. Those are very very relevant topics for what we're putting into our body, and making sure that you're checking out a couple of the very common, and when we say everyone has different sensitivities, there are generalities for foods that are sensitive to the human body. So most of the time we can identify things that are relatively inflammatory for the human body. But again, checking some of that stuff out and analyzing what you eat, maybe go through a 4 or 5 day food log, and then understand how much of whatever it is that you're eating, and give yourself a little checklist there on how to start changing that towards a different route of food. Next, I would say this is probably something that I focus on more so in patient care. We try to focus on everything. We try to make sure that we're hitting everything in terms of food, sleep, stresses, all that stuff. But biomechanics and movement, if there is something that is constantly picking a scab, we have patients that they say every time I do this movement, I end up hurting myself. It's like, okay, that movement is probably picking a scab and creating some sort of inflammatory response in your body. So identifying inflammatory movements or scab picking is very, very important, especially at like the lumbar area. Low back is very, very prevalent in terms of pain. So if we constantly irritate that area over and over again, then that could be, it could turn into a chronic pain, and you didn't even know that all these little movements were kind of stoking your fire or creating some inflammation. So looking at where movement is happening, especially when we're sitting and going to standing, it could look like two different movements. There could be things where we're seated for a really long time, and then we insult the tissues by standing up kind of funky, and then it has that little bit of an irritation, and then you start walking again. That could be one little irritation. If we maybe just have a different strategy of going from seated to standing, we might just reduce that little irritation, especially when it's your body's sensitive to one certain movement. If this movement is sensitive to when our lumbar spine or our low back flexes forward, how can we strategize not to do that and let the inflammatory process do its thing, heal the tissues, and then slowly get back into being able to flex and turn the spine and do all that stuff. So that's what we try to do mostly, is figure out strategies on how to stop picking the scab so that people can actually heal.
So are you saying, Kyle, with this concept that you want to try to vary the strategies that you're doing? Like if something is uncomfortable doing it one way, you probably don't want to keep doing it that way. You might want to try just a different avenue until at some point that gets uncomfortable, or if that gets more comfortable.
Absolutely. If you have that idea or that concept of, okay, these are the things that I can't do right now because doc told me, look, this is actually ticking this stuff off. Or if you figure that out on your own, you need to figure out a different way to do it. And there's a lot of different strategies for movement, as that's what we do. We figure out different strategies for movement, and we let that stuff actually have a chance to heal as opposed to just kind of constantly getting irritated. The roadmap is what's most important, having the concepts and the understanding, and then you just have to employ that with all of your day-to-day activities. Figure out what are all the things that I'm doing that maybe stokes the fire, and sub that stuff out as you go along.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because with that in mind, when you sustain an injury or you're having pain or you had an injury but then it healed, there's processes that your body does from a movement standpoint that help protect the area beyond that healing time. And basically what happens is there's a reduction in the amount of strategies that your body will use. So think of it this way. Let's say you break your arm, which with a gun's that big, how could that thing break, crying out loud? But let's say Kyle breaks his arm, what are we going to do to ensure that your arm heals? We're going to put a cast on it, right? In theory. I'll put a cast on the arm so I reduce movement so the tissues heal. Your body has its own casting system in play. So there's actually some good research out there showing that if someone has a back injury or has back pain, there is, instead of having selective muscular activity of some of your back muscles, it actually like locks into place. So you essentially, camera just died. So you essentially have the, you essentially have that casting mechanism there so the tissues can heal. The issue is, beyond that point in time, that can be maladaptive, because now when I don't have those movement options available, I could be overloading those structures that maybe weren't an issue before, but could be an issue now because you're doing the same strategy over and over and over again.
A brace is like you said, it's a contraction. The longer that we have to hold a contraction, the worse that tissue probably feels contracting all the time, right? So
yeah.
It's just like, imagine doing a bicep flex for 20 minutes. That hurts.
How I start every morning.
Yeah. Like this. And you can hold it for that long, that's going to eventually get you tired, right?
Yeah.
It's going to cause some sort of pain, or you're going to blow a gasket or something. But that's what he's talking about. Having that movement be restricted, and then we got to slowly figure out how to unrestrict that again. And that's where I think a lot of the times with chronic pain patients, with things that don't heal, we don't get back into those movements and try to challenge that tissue. Yeah, it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but understanding that you start chipping away at pain when you start putting yourself in maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable situation. You don't blow the top off and turn it into a 9 out of 10 pain, but you start integrating that stuff a little bit and unlocking those tissues again. It's so important to stress that stuff afterwards, after you've had a significant injury, because you unravel tissues again. You have this freeing effect. It turns the bracing system off at that point.
Yeah, and it's totally normal if you have some soreness and discomfort as you go through that process. So there's a great term, I believe this was David Butler, one of the great pain researchers in our field, where they'll say sore but safe.
Yep.
So, yeah, exactly. So, and I always tell my clients this: if pain was a house, not like the Tyler Perry movie, but House of Pain, or Everlast, his group back in the day, you want to knock on the door. You don't want to bust down the door, because that's a problem. But if you play on the lawn, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
So you want to find that sweet spot when you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked about before, grading pains. If you want to go through a 1 through 10, and we want to go, anything between that 1 and 3 and that 3 to 4, that's something that you might be able to adapt to. But if it is above that, if it's getting 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, obviously 9s and 10s, those things are going to be a little bit more, they're going to damage tissues maybe a little bit further, or you're going to have a little bit more irritation with some of that stuff. So lastly, as these guys are messing with the cameras, they're trying to figure some stuff out, I'll talk a little bit about bad stresses as the third type of influence of inflammatory processes in our body. So as we look at bad stresses, there's a connection to how we process information. So Zach just got back sitting over here, maybe that stressed me out, that they were like working with the camera. That might be a bad stress, but if I handle it correctly, I don't let that latch onto me, and I don't let it have physical connection to me anymore. I say, you know what, Zach, it's okay that battery was on its last leg, not a problem. Now I've gotten rid of that stress.
3 days later.
I can't believe the battery died. Don't let that stuff build up. So what I'm saying is, bad stresses. If we don't know how to handle a bad stress, then we will hold on to that stuff. Our body will start creating this hormone crap storm. Use the PG version of that, and it can create extra inflammatory processes in our body, and then that can be stirred by mental clarity. It can be stirred by a lot of stuff. But how you handle work, home, life stress, those all can play into how much inflammatory processes are going on to your body, and it kind of goes back to having your outlet. What is your outlet to get rid of those stresses? Being able to sleep, recover from day 1 to day 2. Those things will play a big role in your stress and your ability to control how much your body is inflamed by the emotional context of how you operate throughout the day.
Yeah, and if you neglect things like sleep, or if you're having a hard time managing some of those stressors, you will be more inflamed. And I think this other thing that can definitely contribute to inflammation, which is incredibly important right now because of this darn COVID thing going on, is
Listen up.
social connection. So, talking with others. I want you to imagine that Kyle and I are cavemen. All right, I know we're kind of like, yeah, a little bit. I don't have the long hair when I used to have the beard, but let's just imagine we're cavemen. So back in the day, if Kyle and I were part of a tribe, we're around each other a lot, and we're around all of these other people, and what happens when people congregate in a small place? You're closer than 6 feet, and so on and so forth. You're likely to pass stuff along, like different germs,
Yep.
bugs, stuff like that could potentially get you sick. So to protect against that, your body will actually increase its immune system response so you don't get sick and die. But as a consequence of that also, because I'm in a tribe, I have people who will take care of me, I will actually have a reduction in inflammatory markers when I'm in that situation. Because think about it this way, when do we need inflammation? We need inflammation if something is hurting in us. If I hurt myself, I sprained my ankle chasing the saber-toothed tiger.
We're going real
We are. I mean, this
in the
is
caveman world, okay?
caveman as all can be. Kyle, being the caveman chiropractor he is going to take care of me. So I don't need to have this robust inflammatory response because I have people who will help me. I want you to flip-flop that, because now let's say, because I'm me, I've been casted off from the group, they no longer want me there, something about a lack of personality, and I'm stuck in the woods by myself. Well, in that case, I don't have as many people around, so I don't actually need a robust immune reaction, because Kyle's not going to, pass the flu to me. But if I hurt myself out in the wilderness, I'm going to die if I don't heal up as quickly as humanly possible. So you actually will see an increase in inflammatory markers, because that helps me heal fast from that same ankle sprain that I got.
Crazy.
Because it's life or death.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, these systems are still in place. So if you have a robust social life, that doesn't mean you got to hang out with a lot of people, but you feel as though, like, I socially belong to something or a group, you have the same thing. You'll have a high immune system, and you'll have low inflammatory markers. But if you're socially isolated, like this whole year, or being on social media because you don't get the same reaction. There's good research showing that that actually increases your body's systemic, well, bad stress, but also the inflammatory response. Interestingly enough though, if you have purpose, if you have something like a greater good that you are pursuing, so maybe you are not hanging around with a lot of people, but it's because you are building this thing to change the world in some way, shape, or form, and that gives you meaning and purpose, that actually offsets that. But the point being, by me saying this, is perhaps one of the best things you can do to mitigate inflammation is to be around others, be around people that you care about, because it does increase those things. And I think one thing that we learned, I don't know if you had this, but I spent so much time in those first few months of COVID calling people who I haven't talked to in a long time, and then, you know, hanging out doing escape rooms with my boy over here, things like that. Like that's really, really important, and I think it's something that we neglect.
Yeah.
But it's very easy, well maybe it's not easy, but it's something that can have a much more profound effect than we think.
It's twofold there. I mean, you probably get the social interaction where you're happy, you're creating like good hormones in your body, and then you're also getting exposed to other germs, other bugs, like you said. So, I mean, twofold there. Not trying to downplay any of the restrictions or anything like that. You know, we take that very seriously, but at the same time, you know, we know that it can be harmful potentially on the body. You know, if we're isolated for very long periods of time and don't have any outlets for that. So, you know, those are the main topics we really wanted to hit home with you guys. Is that inflammation is something that's natural. We need to make sure that our body's production of inflammatory responses and how quickly they go away, how that is balanced. It has something that is it's a natural occurrence, not just, you know, over the top or none at all. We want to make sure that the food that you choose, you have a context of how to start deciding, hey, look, this might be something that I can use to decrease my overall inflamed state of my body, so that if I do sprain my ankle, I'm not just going like crazy swelling, and I'm not going to have that for a long time. So choosing your foods wisely, and then figuring out, you know, what all the little scab picks that you have throughout the day. That can be very, very helpful if you have nailed your nutrition, you nail sleep, and you nail all the other things. If you figure out that it might be one little movement that you're constantly kind of irritating, maybe if it's you bob your head like this and that causes, you know, irritation, hey, that might be something that causes that little irritation. And then lastly, looking at how to handle bad stresses, meaning from a social distancing standpoint, and then also the work, life, all those types of stresses that you have at home or at your workplace. Making sure that those are the three areas you'll look at to start controlling your inflammatory processes.
Yeah, and you know, we listed these things. That doesn't mean you try to go tackle it all at once. Find the area that you feel like you can make it doesn't have to be a big change, but a small enough change that is sustainable. Start there, and I bet with whatever issues you may have, you'll likely notice things trend in a positive direction.
Yep.
And if you don't, oh my gosh, how'd that get there? Give us a call, 702-558-2151. We would definitely be more than happy to help guide you along the way to getting through the inflammatory process that you may be dealing with. Or if you're not, we'll teach you how to get back into high gear to return to whatever it is you want to do.
Cool.
Do we have any questions from anybody? No? All right.
All right, guys. As always, we'll be back next Wednesday. And if you guys have any comments, concerns, any topics that you want from us, go ahead and reach on out, and we will get those discussed if it's a good one. See you guys.
Sounds good. Later.